Alberta's Rocky Mountains are a place where majestic beauty meets ruthless danger. Here, amidst sharp ridges and deep gorges, nature seems to test anyone who dares to enter its domain. Tall pine trees, cold wind, and crumbling slopes create a world where there is no room for weakness. Every step in these places requires precision and endurance. Wild animals, rock avalanches, and sudden storms make every day in the mountains a challenge. But it is this unpredictability that attracts those who seek the limits of human possibilities, those who are ready to risk everything for a trophy or inner peace. What drives a man who is ready to face the natural elements? The thirst for victory? The spirit of adventure? Or the desire to feel part of something bigger? This story will tell of a man who went to a place where only the strongest survive. It will be a tale of bravery, struggle, and that fine line where survival becomes true mastery. Rocky Mountains of Alberta, Canada. August 24th, 2017. The morning in the mountains was cool and clear. The sun rose slowly, flooding the rocky slopes with soft light. The coniferous forest breathed silence, broken only by rare gusts of wind. Here, at an altitude of 2,000 meters, every step could be the last. Stone avalanches, wild animals, and the vagaries of the weather made this area a test for the bravest. It was hunting season for mountain sheep. Strong, graceful animals with massive curved horns. They lived on steep slopes where one wrong move could cost a life. Finding a ram was a stroke of luck, and capturing one was an achievement only the most experienced could achieve. Jeremy Evans was not looking for an easy way out. For him, hiking in the mountains was more than hunting. It was a challenge, a way to test his strength and feel at one with nature. Jeremy, 32, grew up among forests and rivers. His father taught him everything: to shoot, to survive, to respect the animals that became trophies. For him, hunting was a ritual, a profound, almost sacred process. "This is where you realize how small you are in front of this world," he told his wife as he was packing for the trip. "It's not just a place, it's another world." His family was his pillar of support. His wife and young daughter reminded Jeremy what was worth fighting for. He often told his daughter stories about the animals he met in the mountains, dreaming of taking her hiking with him one day. But she was too young for such adventures. This hike he decided to make alone. His goal was a trophy mountain sheep he had been tracking all summer. It was a symbol of perseverance and the completion of years of searching. At dawn, he was ready. A backpack with his gear stood by the door. A rifle carefully aimed the day before. Water filters, a first aid kit, food for several days. Next to it was a mountain bike, his means of getting to hard-to-reach places. Before heading out, Jeremy checked the list once more. Bear spray, flashlight, knife. These things could save a life. Grizzlies were not uncommon in these parts, and every encounter with them carried deadly danger. Putting on his jacket, he walked over to his family. Kissing his wife, he leaned over to his daughter, who waved her spoon happily. "Be a good girl. I'll be back soon," he said with a smile. His wife nodded, trying to hide her worry. "Just come back," she whispered as she walked him to the door. 3 hours later, Jeremy reached the foot of the mountains. He parked the car, pulled out a map, and checked the route. After tightening the straps of his backpack and making sure his rifle was securely fastened, he got on his bike and began to climb. The trail led upward, through rocky slopes and dense coniferous forest. The wheels struggled through the wet ground, and the 45-pound backpack was weighing down on his shoulders. But Jeremy rode with confidence. Each turn of the pedal, each breath of cold air brought him closer to his goal. The wind was picking up, blowing through the pine trees and bringing the smell of damp soil. The trail grew narrower and narrower, winding between trees, and roots and rocks made the path more difficult. Finally, after 2 hours of climbing, the road became too steep and rocky for the bike. "We'll walk from here," he muttered, assessing the steep climb. Jeremy left the bike under a tall spruce tree next to some eagle bushes. Taking off his backpack, he briefly caught his breath and checked his rifle mounts. There was absolute silence all around, with only occasional bird cries. But this silence seemed strangely tense, as if the forest was watching him. Jeremy pulled up his backpack and began to climb. Branches crunched under his feet, and rocks slipped out from under his boots, but he moved steadily, choosing each step with extreme caution. In a few minutes he reached the plateau. The bushes were thinning here, giving way to open slopes with spectacular views of the surrounding countryside. He pulled out his binoculars and began to survey the opposite slope. The gray rocks concealed movement, but after a moment, Jeremy spotted them. A herd of mountain sheep. They almost blended in with the surrounding landscape, but one in particular stood out. A huge male with massive, perfectly curled horns. It was the exact ram he had come here for. "There he is," Jeremy whispered, feeling his heart beat faster. He took a cautious step forward, preparing to choose a position, but suddenly the silence was broken by the loud cracking of twigs. The sound came from behind him, causing him to freeze. Jeremy turned around slowly. A small brown figure emerged from behind the bushes a few meters away. A bear cub. He froze. Thoughts whirled through his head. The bear cub. Where is his mother? The answer came instantly. A female bear crawled out of the thicket. Her dark brown fur shimmered in the sunlight, and her eyes burned with fury. She stood on her hind legs, letting out a roar that shattered the silence. Jeremy froze. The rifle hung behind his back, and the can of bear spray was deep in his backpack. He didn't have time to think. "Don't move," he commanded himself, but the bear had already made up her mind. With a wild roar, she rushed forward. Jeremy had time only to snatch his backpack from his shoulder and thrust it out in front of him. The bear's blow threw him backward. He slammed into a rock, the impact on his back, and his breath caught. Through the noise in his ears, Jeremy heard the snarl of the beast and the cracking of cloth. The bear was tearing the backpack with its claws, turning it to shreds. It was the only barrier between them. "Spray! Spray!" the mind screamed, but the body wouldn't listen. Jeremy watched the beast's claws pierce the thick fabric and realized that time was running out. Gathering his last strength, he sharply let go of the backpack and rolled to the side. The bear immediately rushed after him. Her breath was close, but Jeremy had time to fumble for a large rock on the ground. He picked it up and threw it at the beast's face. The rock struck the grizzly on the nose with a thud. The bear snorted, shook its head, and stood still for a moment. That brief moment was enough for Jeremy to jump up and dash toward the nearest trees. Each second stretched like an eternity. Jeremy climbed the nearest spruce, using his last strength. The rough branches tore the skin on his palms, but he continued, ignoring the pain. Below, a bear snarled and clawed at the trunk. The tree shook, as did Jeremy himself, trying to hold back a noisy breath. A minute seemed like an hour. Finally, the bear stopped, sucked in air noisily, and let out a low, ominous growl. A few more seconds and it turned around, slowly disappearing into the bushes. Jeremy didn't move. Even as her silhouette disappeared, he continued to listen. It seemed any sound could bring her back. "I'm alive," he breathed out, feeling tears running down his cheeks. When he finally decided to get down, his body responded with pain with every movement. His bruised shoulder throbbed, his palms burned, and his back felt stiff. His backpack was lying nearby, its contents scattered around him. First aid kit, food, flashlight, everything looked like it had been through a meat grinder. Jeremy spotted a can of bear spray amidst the chaos. He bent down, picked it up, and only shook his head. The useless thing that could have saved him moments ago now just lay at his feet as a reminder of how close he was to death. Jeremy quickly looked over his belongings, trying to keep his mind clear. He didn't have much left. 2 bottles of water, half of his food supplies, a knife, and a rifle that by some miracle was still intact. The first aid kit was also intact, but the bandages were soaked from the water that had spilled into the backpack. Without wasting time, he gathered what he could, slung the rifle behind his back, and headed down to where he'd left the bike. With each step, the pain echoed throughout his body. Fear lodged in the back of his mind, and he listened for every rustle. Jeremy knew he was on the edge. "The important thing is to get out," he repeated to himself, glancing over his shoulder. The forest, which had seemed peaceful in the morning, was now terrifying. Every crunch of a branch made him clutch his rifle harder. Finally, he reached the bike. A faint spark of hope flared in his chest. He gripped the frame tightly with both hands and felt the road to salvation getting closer. But the joy did not last long. As he began to move, a familiar growl cut through the air. His heart sank. Jeremy looked around sharply. Between the trees, treading heavily on the ground, she appeared. The bear had returned. The grizzly rushed forward, shaking the ground with each heavy paw. Jeremy didn't even have time to reach for his rifle. In desperation, he pushed the bike toward her, but the bear swung her paw like a toy, tossing it aside. Without a second's hesitation, Jeremy sprinted. The pain in his leg pierced every step, but he kept moving. To stop meant death. The run didn't last long. The bear caught up with him in seconds. Something heavy hit him in the back, knocking him off his feet. Jeremy felt sharp claws rip through his jacket, and then a terrible pain pierced his right arm as the jaws of the beast closed. A scream ripped from his chest, shattering the silence. The bear shook him like a rag doll and tossed him aside. Jeremy collapsed to the ground, lying on his back. Blood was pouring from his face, and his left leg was stiff. He saw the bear approaching. The huge beast growled, preparing to deliver the killing blow. Something clicked inside Jeremy. It wasn't fear, but pure survival instinct. As the bear opened its jaws for another strike, Jeremy jerked his left hand up and thrust it straight into the beast's throat. His fingers found its tongue, and he squeezed it as hard as he could. The bear wheezed sharply, shaking its head. Jeremy felt the sharp claws digging into his body again, but he didn't let go. The pain was unbearable, but he held on, realizing there would be no other chance. Finally, the beast backed away. The grizzly gasped, spitting up blood, and after a short, angry growl, slowly turned and disappeared into the woods. Jeremy was left lying on the ground. His body was battered, blood flowing from many cuts, but he was alive. Jeremy lay motionless, feeling every part of his body throbbing with pain. His right arm hung lifeless. He knew immediately that it was broken. His face stung, and his left leg responded with sharp pain at any movement. With difficulty, he pulled out his cell phone and turned on the camera. The screen reflected a face he barely recognized. His right side was covered in blood. Part of his ear was missing, and a deep laceration on his cheekbone exposed skin and muscle. The sight would have broken anyone, but Jeremy suppressed his fear. He didn't have time to think. He understood. Staying here meant facing the bear again, but even making his way down in his condition was nearly impossible. Jeremy opened the messaging app and began typing, "I love you. Take care of our baby girl. I'm sorry I won't be back." He knew the messages wouldn't send because there was no signal, but if he was found, those words would be the last thing left of him. Gathering the rest of his strength, he tore open his jacket and bandaged his wounds. The bandages were crooked, the weak knots unraveling, but there was no other option. He needed to move while he had any energy left. Leaning on his healthy arm, Jeremy began to slowly crawl down the path. Every meter was a struggle. Sharp rocks and branches jabbed into his body. His clothes clung to the ground, but he kept going. His phone became his only solace. He turned on some music and found a song he often hummed to his daughter, "Baby Shark." The sounds of that tune, utterly absurd amidst the silence of the woods, seemed the only link to home. The tune did more than distract. It reminded Jeremy who he had to keep going for her sake, for the sake of his family. The music played over and over, as if trying to drown out the pain and fear plaguing Jeremy's mind. He crawled slowly down the path, using the rifle as a crutch. Every movement felt like a dull, aching pain in his broken arm and shattered knee. The wound stung like fire, but he didn't stop. The tune of Baby Shark, sounding strange and out of place amidst the gloomy forest, became his anchor. The sounds brought him back to home, to memories of his daughter, how she clapped her hands, laughed, and danced. These images held him, keeping him from falling and giving up. Time stretched into infinity. Finally, after hours of grueling struggle, Jeremy reached a bend. From there he had a view of the parking lot. His truck stood nearby, a bright spot in the trees. His heart clenched with relief. It seemed to him that this was a dream, that reality was about to fade away. Jeremy fell to his knees, gasping in pain and exhaustion. But salvation was still a long way off. In front of him lay a steep descent, studded with sharp rocks and overgrown with bushes. As he looked down, he realized that he had almost no strength left. It seemed impossible to crawl any farther. "For their sake," he whispered through clenched teeth. Gathering the last of his strength, Jeremy stood up. He leaned on his rifle like a crutch and slowly began his descent. With each step, the rocks slid under his feet. The bushes clung to his clothes, but he moved forward, step by step. But the ground treacherously slipped from under his feet. Jeremy stumbled and flew downward. His body was thrown like a marionette against rocks and branches. Each blow hurt like a sharp pain, but he couldn't stop. Finally, his battered and exhausted body came to a halt at the very bottom. Jeremy lay on the ground, his breathing ragged and ragged. His body seemed leadenly heavy, pinning him to the cold ground. A frightening thought flashed through his mind. "I'm not going to make it." With an effort, he reached for the phone. His hands shook with weakness, his fingers barely obeying. Jeremy opened the camera and recorded a short video. "I did the best I could. Love you, always will." His voice trembled, snapped, but it didn't matter. He just wanted those words to stay, even if he himself didn't survive. But at that moment, like an echo, his daughter's voice echoed in his mind. The laughter, the clapping of her little hands, the joyful song these images flashed through his mind, making his heart clench. It became the spark that lifted him off the ground. Gathering the last of his strength, Jeremy stood up and began to crawl toward the car. His body was battered, his movements slow and painful, but he didn't stop. When he finally reached the truck, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely open the door. Jeremy collapsed into the seat, gasping with relief and pain. His fingers fumbled for the key in the ignition. The engine started, and the truck started slowly, rocking over the bumps. Jeremy rolled down the window to let the cool air hit his face. It helped keep his consciousness, even though his vision was blurry and his thoughts were jumbled. He focused on the bright line of the road as if it were the only thread linking him to life. "Just a little more," he whispered, gritting his teeth and gripping the steering wheel tightly. Time seemed to stand still, but finally lights flickered in the distance. A small village, only a few houses, seemed to Jeremy like a light of salvation. He pulled up in front of an old hunting lodge, barely able to stay on his feet, tumbled out of the car, and staggered toward the door. As Jeremy knocked on the door, footsteps were heard from inside. The door opened ajar and a child appeared on the doorstep. Seeing Jeremy covered in blood and dirt, barely able to stand on his feet, the child screamed in terror. "Help!" Jeremy wheezed, holding onto the door jamb. His voice was weak, barely audible. "Bear!" Those words were enough for the adults in the house to rush to him. People scooped him up under their arms, sat him in a chair, and brought him water. Someone was already calling emergency services. Jeremy felt his strength finally leaving him. In the distance, he heard the sound of a helicopter approaching. The barely audible rumble grew louder, but Jeremy's consciousness faded before he could see rescue. He woke up a few days later. The hospital room was flooded with soft light. His body was almost completely covered in bandages, and his left leg was in a cast. Jeremy wrinkled his nose in pain, but immediately felt a warm touch. It was his wife. She sat beside him, eyes red from crying, but smiled as she squeezed his hand. "You're back," she whispered, her voice trembling with overwhelming emotion. Their daughter stood nearby, holding a small toy shark. Shyly taking a step forward, she held the toy out to her father. Jeremy struggled to lift his healthy hand, ran his fingers through her soft hair, and said quietly, "I'm home." Tears rolled down his cheeks. Jeremy spent several weeks in the hospital. Doctors performed several complex surgeries, skin grafts on his face, repairing damaged tendons. He relearned how to move, overcoming physical pain. But the hardest part was dealing with the memories. The nightmares would take him back to that day, to the second he looked into the eyes of an angry bear. But Jeremy wasn't alone. His family was always there for him. His wife, squeezing his hand, reminding him that he had already won. And his daughter, clapping her hands and humming "Baby Shark," made him smile. Every day he grew stronger, not only physically but mentally as well. The ordeal he went through changed him forever. But the love of his family helped him believe that there was a future ahead of him that was worth fighting for. "Every step I took that day, I took for you," Jeremy said quietly to his wife as they drove home. His voice was subdued, but there was a sincerity in it that was backed by the horror he had endured. Despite everything he'd endured, Jeremy hadn't given up hiking in the mountains, but now his approach to it had changed forever. Along with his rifle, he always took a satellite beacon, a walkie-talkie, and not one but 2 cans of bear spray. He knew that nature could be beautiful as well as ruthless. "My life changed forever, but it reminded me that it was worth fighting for," he told friends over coffee, sharing his experiences. Jeremy's story quickly spread around the area, becoming a legend among local hunters. His tenacity, incredible fortitude, and will to survive became an example for many. But for Jeremy himself, it wasn't a feat. For him, it was a reminder of how valuable family is, of how far a man can go for those he loves. Jeremy's story reminds us of the value of life and how far a person can go for their loved ones. What would you do if you were him? Would you look for another way out or continue the fight to the end? Share your opinion in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this incredible story, please support us by liking, subscribing to the channel, and clicking on the bell so you don't miss new videos. Your likes and subscriptions help our channel grow and motivate us to tell more amazing stories. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Remember, even in the most difficult situations, we have the strength to fight. See you in the next video.